The sun rose early that morning, casting gold over the village rooftops and bathing the mango trees in a soft, warm glow. Chickens clucked in the distance, smoke curled from the kitchen huts, and already the compound of Mama Jalea buzzed with excitement. Women stirred pots of spiced rice and cassava, children ran with sticks tied to rubber wheels, and the old men sat under the baobab tree pretending not to gossip, but failing miserably. Amina was coming home. After 3 long years in the city, chasing her dream of becoming a teacher, she was finally returning, with a certificate in her hand and a heart full of plans. The village had followed her story like a beloved serial on the radio. They knew how she used to study by firelight as a child. How she braided her sister's hair every morning before walking 5 kilometers to school. How she never looked back when Malik first proposed, insisting she would only wear the wedding beads after building her own future. Now she was back, stronger, wiser. And with the date of her wedding finally set, Amina arrived in a taxi with a cracked windshield and one door that needed 2 men to open. She stepped out in a simple blue dress, her hair tied in a cloth the color of honey. Dust clung to her shoes, but her smile lit the yard like a lantern in darkness. Before she could even gather her bags, children swarmed her, shouting, "Teacher Amina! Teacher Amina!" Behind them, Mama Jalea ran forward, her wrapper flapping around her ankles. She opened her arms wide and caught Amina in a tight embrace, whispering prayers into her ear between joyful sobs. Amina laughed, eyes wet, and held her mother close, breathing in the familiar scent of charcoal, herbs, and home. Not far behind stood Zuri. She clapped like the others, smiling softly, but there was something different in her eyes. She had grown more beautiful in Amina's absence. Her skin deeper, her waist fuller, her voice quieter. When Amina finally turned to her, Zuri hesitated a second too long before hugging her. Amina didn't notice. "You're so grown now," Amina said with a playful nudge. "Are you sure you're still my little sister?" Zuri laughed gently, her eyes darting away. "Always." Mama Jalea took Amina's bag and led the way inside, talking non-stop. "Your room is just as you left it, but I added a new mat and mosquito net. Malik came last week, he's been repairing the old storeroom near the church. Everyone's talking about the wedding. You've become the village pride." Amina chuckled, brushing dust from her sleeve. "Mama, let me breathe. I haven't even sat down yet." The compound filled quickly with visitors. Neighbors, cousins, old classmates. Auntie Lindai brought roasted groundnuts in a calabash. Elder Ngoma brought his usual stream of proverbs. Everyone had something to say about Amina's return, but it was Malik's name that floated most frequently in the conversations. "So when is the great builder coming to see his bride?" one woman teased, elbowing Mama Jalea. Amina blushed. "He's busy, I'm sure he'll come later." "He must be the luckiest man alive," someone added. "Even his bones must be smiling." Zuri stood at the edge of the group, watching. She laughed when others did, clapped when stories were told, but inside, her heart pounded like the village drum. Each mention of Malik scraped against her ribcage like a dull knife. The guilt had sat inside her for months, coiled like a snake, whispering and waiting. Malik hadn't yet come to greet Amina. By evening, the compound quieted. The sun dipped low, casting shadows across the red earth. Amina sat under the neem tree in the backyard, sipping millet porridge and listening to the crickets sing. Zuri came and sat beside her, folding her legs and wrapping her arms around her knees. "You've changed," Zuri said softly. "I hope for the better," Amina replied, her tone light. "You look different too. Grown. Are you seeing someone?" Zuri's mouth opened and closed. "No," she lied. "No one." Amina smiled and bumped her shoulder against hers. "You'll tell me when the time comes." The silence after that stretched too long. Zuri picked at the hem of her wrapper, fingers trembling slightly. The stars were beginning to peek through the indigo sky. Somewhere in the distance, a hyena laughed. "I missed you, Amina," Zuri whispered. "I missed you more," Amina said without hesitation. Inside, Mama Jalea hummed as she folded linen. The lanterns flickered behind the window. Amina's future felt like it was finally beginning. Her school plans, her marriage to Malik, her place in the village. But the wind carried whispers. And though Amina laughed and made plans and dreamed without fear, she did not yet see the cracks beneath her joy. Zuri saw them all too well. She just didn't know how long it would take for them to break open. And neither sister knew that before the next moon waned, everything they believed about love, loyalty, and forgiveness would be rewritten in the dust of that same compound. The days after Amina's return passed like a sweet dream. The morning sun always found her in the small classroom beside the church, surrounded by the village's youngest daughters. She taught them how to read, how to calculate coins, how to question the world gently but with courage. The girls adored her, calling her Teacher Amina with pride. Their mothers brought woven baskets as gifts, and their fathers often nodded with admiration as they passed her on the road. But when the final bell rang each afternoon, Amina shifted into another role, the bride-to-be. Wedding preparations began with a rhythm only women knew: song, sweat, thread, and fire. Aunties from 3 neighboring villages arrived to help. They measured her for her dress, folded kitenge fabrics into regal headpieces, and debated whether the reception should be near the river or beneath the mango trees. Laughter swirled in the air like birds at sunset. Drummers began rehearsing. The goat chosen for the ceremony was already fattening behind the family kitchen. Amina floated through it all with joy, barely touching the ground. She held a small notebook where she listed every detail. 3 drums, not 2. Sorghum beer for the elders. Fresh white sand for the path to the altar. She stayed up late most nights cross-checking everything with her mother, her voice rising and falling with excitement. Zuri sat nearby those evenings, silent, stitching patterns into fabric or pretending to sleep. When the wedding dress finally arrived, delivered from the city by a cousin, the women gathered around to open the box. The fabric shimmered like early morning dew. Soft ivory with gold threading along the hem, beads sewn in spirals that caught the sun. Amina's eyes welled with tears as she held it against herself. "Can you believe I'll wear this in front of the whole village?" Zuri stood beside her but didn't speak. She smiled faintly and turned her gaze downward. One of the aunties nudged her. "Zuri, when will you wear your own wedding beads?" Zuri laughed weakly, her voice caught in her throat. "One day," she whispered. But that night, long after the house had gone quiet, she sat outside by the water drums and wept quietly into her hands. The guilt had bloomed into something alive. It wrapped around her chest and squeezed until she struggled to breathe. Every time Malik walked into the compound to deliver an update on the roofing or to speak with Amina's father about bride price details, Zuri vanished. She busied herself with washing or feeding the chickens, or pretending to fetch herbs from the bush. She couldn't bear to look into Amina's eyes. Not after what she had done. The memory refused to stay buried. The flashbacks crept in with the night winds. She could still see that rain-soaked night in the city, the way Malik had knocked on the guesthouse door where she stayed during her short visit to Amina. Amina had been away for a school retreat, and Zuri had been left behind just for one night. It was supposed to be harmless. He came with food, with old jokes, with stories about the village. Then he started talking about how long Amina had been gone. How lonely he felt. How Zuri had grown into a beautiful woman. She remembered the way he touched her hand and how she hadn't pulled back fast enough. Shame had come after, thick and choking, but too late. What started as one reckless night of weakness spiraled into something worse. A few more secret meetings, a quiet ceremony in the city, and then silence. Zuri begged him to tell Amina, but he always answered the same way: "Let her finish her studies first. We'll find the right time. If you love her, let her have her moment." Now Amina's moment was here, and Malik was still pretending. The wedding was scheduled for the end of the month, but Malik had already postponed the official introduction once. "The roof isn't finished," he told Amina. "The pastor had another engagement," he said another time. "The cloth for the groom's men hasn't arrived." Amina nodded each time, trusting, forgiving, patient. But Baba, their father, frowned during those conversations. He didn't say much, but his eyes grew darker each time Malik spoke. One night, after Malik left, he turned to Amina quietly and asked, "Does he still love you the way he used to?" Amina smiled, brushing flour from her hands. "He's just busy. He wants everything to be perfect." Baba didn't respond. He simply nodded and returned to his chair under the tree, rubbing his hands together slowly, the way he always did when the air was heavy with unspoken thoughts. One evening, as Amina and Mama sat outside rehearsing the wedding ceremony, Zuri excused herself and walked deep into the bush path that led to the old borehole. She needed air. She needed silence. She needed anything that would drown the voice in her head calling her traitor. She stared at her reflection in the still water, her face warped by ripples. "You broke your sister," she whispered aloud. "And she doesn't even know it." She pressed her hand to her flat belly, where she once thought something might have grown, but it hadn't. The healer had said it wasn't time. Zuri had wept then too. A child might have forced the truth out. But now, all she had was this horrible silence between herself and the sister who trusted her more than anyone in the world. Later that week, Amina tried on her dress again. The whole compound gathered to admire her. Zuri helped zip the back of it, her hands trembling. Amina caught her eye in the mirror. You're shaking. Are you okay? Zuri forced a laugh. Just nervous for you. Amina reached and squeezed her hand. Don't be. Everything's finally falling into place. Zuri couldn't respond. She excused herself once again, rushing behind the kitchen hut, where she clutched her chest and tried to steady her breath. And still the village danced and prepared and sang. The wedding drums grew louder. The flowers were gathered. The goats were marked. But inside Zuri's chest, something was collapsing. And Malik, for all his strength and skill as a builder, had no plan to stop it. The city buzzed with a rhythm that Zuri had never known before. The honking of cars, the cries of street hawkers, the scent of roasted maize mixing with the sharp edge of diesel. It overwhelmed her senses when she first stepped off the dusty village bus. She had never been that far from home alone. Her mother had handed her the bundle of food wrapped in banana leaves, and Amina had sent money for transport. It was supposed to be a simple visit. Just a few days to help her sister settle into her new hostel room and bring a taste of home to her plate. Amina was excited to see her. They laughed late into the night that first evening, sorting through books, folding clothes, hanging small decorations Zuri had woven herself. But the next morning, Amina left early for a week-long residential training retreat at a nearby college compound. It wasn't supposed to be a problem. Zuri would stay behind, rest, maybe even see a bit of the city before heading back to the village. But it rained on the third night. Not just a drizzle, a heavy, unforgiving rain. The kind that made the rooftops groan and the streets disappear. The kind that made every plan dissolve into steam. Zuri was caught outside, just a short distance from the hostel, returning from a small market nearby. She had taken shelter under a shop's awning, but the water was pooling quickly and she was soaked to the bone. She clutched the paper bag of groundnuts and tomatoes tightly, teeth chattering. Then came the sound of a familiar voice behind her. Zuri. She turned. Malik stood there with an umbrella, equally wet, shirt clinging to his chest. His eyes were surprised but not unkind. Amina had told her earlier that Malik would be in the city to buy some materials for a construction project, and that he might pass by to check on her. She's not here, Zuri said quickly. Amina left for training. Malik nodded. I know. She told me. But you shouldn't be out here alone. Zuri tried to smile. It wasn't supposed to rain like this. He held out the umbrella. Come. I booked a guest room nearby for the night. You'll catch your death standing in this. Zuri hesitated, then followed. The guest house was simple, just a small room with a metal bed and a flickering ceiling fan. Malik ordered hot tea and boiled eggs from the front desk. He handed her a towel and insisted she change into one of Amina's old sweaters that was still in his bag. Zuri was quiet, uncomfortable, but grateful. She didn't want to admit it, but it felt good to sit, warm, dry, not afraid. Malik didn't talk much at first. He looked tired. There were bags under his eyes she hadn't seen before. She works too hard, he muttered. Always studying, always running. Zuri chuckled lightly. That's Amina. She wants to prove herself. Malik looked at her. And you? What do you want? The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her that before. I don't know, she said softly. I just follow where I'm needed. He stared at her for a long time. The rain battered the window. Somewhere a car alarm wailed. The fan creaked. You've grown, he said. You look different. Zuri turned away, flustered. It's just the sweater. He stepped closer. Too close. Don't, she whispered, but her voice lacked the strength it needed. And when his hand touched hers, when his breath came close, when loneliness and longing drowned everything they had been raised to believe, she didn't pull away. That night became a secret. A one-time mistake they told themselves. The next morning they avoided eye contact. Zuri packed her bag and returned to the village the following day. Amina never suspected a thing. She hugged Zuri hard and promised to write soon. But the letters began. From Malik. Small notes, folded in neat squares, tucked into fabric bundles or handed over by distant cousins on quiet trips to the city. He spoke of confusion, of regret, of something between them that couldn't be ignored. Zuri read each one under the moonlight, heart racing. She told herself it meant nothing, that it would fade. But it didn't. 2 months later, when she returned to the city with her uncle for a church conference, Malik met her secretly at a roadside cafe. I've spoken to someone, he said. A man who can do quiet unions. No ceremony, no family, no questions. Zuri stared at him, horrified. Are you mad? He leaned forward. I've already done wrong. We both have. But if something happens later, If you carry something, we need protection. I'm not carrying anything, she whispered. Yet. His logic was flawed, but his eyes were earnest. Or maybe afraid. Or maybe cunning. Zuri couldn't tell anymore. She hated him. And she didn't. She agreed. The marriage took place on a Wednesday afternoon. A man with a worn Bible and a gold tooth stood under the crooked roof of a broken kiosk on the city's outskirts. It rained again. Not heavy like before, but enough to make the ground slick. Zuri signed her name with trembling fingers. Malik kissed her cheek. No rings. No vows. Just 2 names on a piece of paper, and a witness who never asked why the bride's eyes looked like she was burying herself alive. Afterwards, Malik returned to his rented flat. Zuri took the bus back to the village. They spoke once the following week. Then silence. Letters stopped. She thought it was over. That maybe it had never counted. Until Amina announced she was coming home. Until Mama Jalea started talking about wedding dates. Until Malik returned to the village with roses and offers of cattle, pretending nothing had ever happened between them. Zuri stood beside him during ceremonies and introductions, her hands folded neatly, her mouth sealed shut. She watched her sister smile, plan, dream. And she remembered that paper, that storm, that night. What had started with rain and weakness had become a wall she could not climb. And now it was Amina's name being sewn onto the wedding fabric. But the one who wore the veil first was her. The garden was quiet that evening. The cassava leaves rustled lightly in the breeze, and the orange sun sank slowly behind the hills, casting the compound in warm, golden light. Amina sat on a low stool near the pawpaw tree, sorting dry beans into a wide calabash. Her feet were bare, her wrap loose from a long day of teaching and planning. Zuri stood at the edge of the garden, her hands twisting the hem of her dress, the weight of the last 6 months pressing heavily on her chest. 3 days. Only 3 days remained before the wedding. The compound was full of laughter and color. Guests had started to arrive. The old women had already selected the songs for the bridal procession. Auntie Lindai had prepared special perfume oils. The smell of roasted plantains drifted through the air. It should have been joy. But Zuri's stomach twisted. Her legs trembled. Amina, she said, her voice barely audible. Amina looked up, smiling. You're back from the market? Did you get the blue beads? Zuri nodded but didn't move closer. I need to tell you something. Amina paused, sensing the change in tone. She placed the calabash down and gave her sister her full attention. What is it? You look like you've seen a ghost. Zuri's lips trembled. Her heart beat so hard it echoed in her ears. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came. She took a deep breath. It's about Malik. Amina's eyebrows drew together. What about him? Zuri lowered her gaze. Wait. It started in the city. When I came to visit. The night it rained. Amina didn't blink. Zuri's voice cracked. He was supposed to check on you. You were gone. It was just one night at first. Amina stood slowly, her eyes never leaving her sister's face. What are you saying, Zuri? Zuri covered her mouth with both hands, sobbing. I didn't plan it. I swear to you, Amina. I didn't plan it. But it happened. And then he said we had to protect you. That we should wait to tell you after you finished your studies. But then you came home and we didn't say anything. We just kept going. The silence between them cracked like thunder. Amina stepped back, her face frozen, pale. No. Zuri nodded, tears pouring freely now. We were married. In secret. In the city. No, Amina repeated, this time louder. Her voice shook. No. You're lying. Zuri dropped to her knees. I'm so sorry, Amina. Please believe me, I didn't want this. You're lying. Amina screamed. You're my sister. The sound of the scream pierced the compound. Birds scattered. A pot clattered inside the kitchen. Mama Jalea ran out, wiping her hands on her wrapper. What is it? What happened? Amina's voice was strangled. Ask her. Ask your daughter what she did. Zuri collapsed completely onto the ground, wailing. Mama, I didn't mean to. I was scared. I didn't know how to stop it. Amina turned on her heel and ran. She stormed through the compound, past the staring eyes of relatives, down the dusty path to where Malik was supervising the delivery of wedding chairs. Her dress flew behind her like a flame. He turned at the sound of her steps, confused. Amina? She didn't stop. Her palm cracked across his face before she could speak. Tell them, she shouted. Tell them what you did. Malik's face was still red from the slap. He looked around at the curious workers, at the aunties frozen in their tasks. I didn't mean for it to go this far, he muttered. Tell them. Amina screamed again. Malik wiped his mouth, then lowered his eyes. It was a mistake, he said. A mistake with consequences. We didn't want to hurt you. The village erupted within the hour. By nightfall it seemed every ear had heard. Women shook their heads and clicked their tongues in disbelief. Men grumbled under their breath. How can a man take two sisters? Someone whispered. What kind of shame is this? Another spat. What family allows such disgrace? Baba sat in silence on the front porch, staring at the ground. When he finally spoke, it was barely more than a whisper. My heart has never known this kind of wound. Mama Jalea tried to cover her mouth with her wrapper to muffle her sobs. She hovered over Amina, trying to keep her from tearing her dress apart, from storming out into the night barefoot. Don't do anything foolish, child, she whispered, holding her by the shoulders. Amina's eyes blazed. You expect me to just sit here and swallow this? You are strong, her mother said gently. Don't let them see you break. Amina looked down at her trembling hands, her breath shallow, her body trembling from within. I was building a life, and they burned it like trash. The following morning, Zuri's mat was gone from the compound. She had packed her things in silence before the sun rose and left without a word. The air felt emptier somehow. Malik disappeared shortly after. He was last seen heading to his uncle's hut at the edge of the village, his shoulders heavy, his steps slow. Some say he wept. Others say he showed no remorse. But Amina didn't care to know. She had erased his name from every item in her notebook. The wedding guests began leaving the compound with uncomfortable excuses. The music stopped. The decorations were taken down. And Amina, once full of laughter and light, sat quietly by the fire pit that night, staring into the embers. She did not speak. She did not cry. But inside, something had shattered beyond recognition. And even though the drums were silent, the village still echoed with the sound of betrayal. The drums had stopped. The food had spoiled. The wedding that once stirred excitement in every compound had now become a hushed topic people chewed on like bitter cola, spitting it out only behind closed doors. Amina no longer walked the village paths. She no longer taught, sang, or even sat under the neem tree where the elders played their board games. Instead, she locked herself inside the hut Malik had built, stone by stone, hand by hand, back when their future felt solid and sincere. The very walls now seemed to mock her. The same walls where he had once measured the light so their future children wouldn't squint. Where he carved their initials behind the window frame. Where he promised forever. Now she lived inside that promise like a tomb. At first, the silence was hers alone. But the village doesn't tolerate silence for long. 3 days after Zuri's disappearance, a line of aunties gathered at her gate, each holding something: cassava flour, dried fish, sweet bananas, pity tucked between their fingers like hidden knives. They sang softly, their voices tender, but their words carried undertones of something less gentle. You are strong, Amina, they said. But you must speak. One auntie, her head high with pride, said louder than the others, you must curse them both in front of the elders. Let the village know you reject their names. Let your shame fall back on them. Amina said nothing. She served tea, nodded where polite, but never let her eyes rise. She's too quiet, another whispered. They'll think she accepts it. A third woman, round, loud, and known for bringing news as fast as rain, leaned forward and hissed, how can you let your sister live under the same sky as you? What kind of woman forgives such filth? That one made Amina flinch, though she quickly masked it. Her hands clenched on the teacup. Not from weakness, but from restraint. They left after an hour. Some frustrated, others satisfied, most confused by her refusal to rage. One even muttered, maybe she's hiding something too. The next morning the elders arrived. Not with gifts but with expectations. They sat in a circle beneath the baobab tree. Amina was called. She came wearing a faded wrapper and a scarf tied without care. Her face was calm. Too calm. The eldest man spoke gently, we understand your pain, daughter. This is not just a betrayal of the heart but of the clan. Such things must be corrected in public. You must spit upon their names. Let it be known they are not welcome in your breath. Amina looked up, finally. Her voice was soft but clear. If I speak in anger, will my womb feel better? The elders blinked. One cleared his throat. If I curse them, she continued, will I sleep with peace at night? Will the goats come back? Will the drums play again? No one answered. She rose. Then I choose silence. And walked away. The whispers turned to murmurings. Some called her weak. Others said she had a hidden plan. A few said she had lost her mind. But Amina didn't respond. She went back to the stone hut. She swept the floor. She boiled tea. She fed herself in small bites. On the 5th day of her retreat from the world, it rained. Not a heavy storm, just a gentle, cleansing rain. She sat near the window watching it fall when she heard a knock. She ignored it. Then another. Then a small voice barely audible through the door. "Teacher?" She froze. Another knock. Then several. Then more voices. "Teacher Amina, are you there?" When she opened the door, her breath caught. 12 little girls stood under the overhang, soaked from the rain, clutching a bundle wrapped in palm fronds. Their eyes were wide, unsure. But each of them held something in their hands. A notebook. The oldest stepped forward, her braids clinging to her neck. She held out the bundle. "It's from all of us," she said. Amina unwrapped it slowly. Inside were dozens of pages, torn from exercise books, each filled with the same phrase written in different handwriting. "We need you." Some added, "Please come back." Others had little hearts drawn in the margins. One wrote, "My sister says she learned numbers because of you. She's not scared of counting anymore." Amina clutched the papers to her chest. The tightness in her lungs, the heaviness in her belly, the steel band around her heart, all loosened just a little. She looked at them, these girls who still saw her as whole. As needed. As more than what had been done to her. And for the first time in days she exhaled. "I'm not ready," she said softly. "That's okay," the oldest girl replied. "We'll wait." Then, without another word, they left, one by one, like small raindrops returning to the soil. Inside the hut, Amina sat on the ground surrounded by the notes. The pain was still there. The shame still burned. But something had shifted. Not in the village. Not in Malik. Not even in Zuri. But inside her. And sometimes that's where healing begins. Zuri woke before the roosters. Not because she had to, but because sleep had stopped visiting her with kindness. The makeshift mat she laid on was barely thick enough to cushion the cold of the cracked kitchen floor she now called home. Once a place for fire and food, now only cobwebs and silence greeted her. Behind her uncle's compound, the abandoned kitchen had been offered without warmth. No one dared host a woman who had taken her sister's man in secret. The shame clung to her like dust on damp skin. Even when she scrubbed herself raw, it would not leave. She had not seen Amina since that night. The night her voice trembled through a confession, her tears soaking into the soil of their family garden. A garden once filled with their laughter. Amina had stood still, quiet like death, until she screamed a sound Zuri could still hear echoing in her skull. Then she vanished into the dark, and so had the world Zuri once knew. Malik was no longer the man who had whispered sweet nothings into her confusion, who had pressed trembling lips on her forehead while promising they'd make things right. Now he avoided her like the curse everyone said she had brought. He hadn't visited in days. And when he did, it was in silence, standing by the doorway, eyes hollow, jaw tight. Once she reached for him, he flinched. Another time she begged, "Tell them. Tell them we didn't mean to destroy her." He turned and left without a word. His business, once the pride of the village, began crumbling. It started with small whispers, clients pulling out of contracts, women refusing to let their husbands work under a betrayer, children pointing and laughing as he passed. One elder said bluntly, "No home built by the back of betrayal will ever stand." By the 3rd week, Malik had lost the community hall contract. Then the irrigation project. Then quietly, the church pulled out of the roofing job he had been depending on for months. He began to drink, not wildly, just enough to dull the sound of stones being thrown at his compound gate. Zuri watched it all from her corner behind the compound. And yet, no one hated him the way they hated her. The difference between being the one chosen and the one who said yes was clearer now than ever. So she folded herself into silence, moving through the village like wind, felt but never acknowledged. At the health center, she started sweeping floors in the early mornings. Not for pay. Not for recognition. Just to keep her hands busy. Mama Grace, the old midwife, didn't chase her away. Maybe out of pity. Maybe out of exhaustion. But she let her wash the linens, burn soiled gauze, clean the benches with ash and water. Once, a young girl walked in holding a bleeding foot. Zuri cleaned the wound gently. The girl's mother yanked her away. "We don't want her filth touching us." Zuri said nothing. She never said anything anymore. But every night, when the rest of the village slept and only the owls called through the trees, she wrote letters to Amina. Dozens of them. Some were tear-stained. Some were smudged from trembling fingers. Some were just 2 words, "I'm sorry." Others unraveled page after page of regret, memory, longing. She never sent a single one. Because how could words undo what her actions had done? Her body was still thin from skipped meals. Her eyes held the same weight as widows. Her spirit floated between self-loathing and silent pleas to God. Not for forgiveness, she no longer believed she deserved it, but for Amina's peace. Zuri had never wanted Malik. Not truly. What she had wanted was to feel seen. She had always lived in Amina's shadow, the smarter one, the loved one, the chosen one. Malik had looked at her once with softness, and in a moment of weakness she thought maybe she mattered too. But now, everything she had gained had turned into ash. One morning, while boiling water behind the health center, she heard Mama Grace call her name. Girl. Zuri turned, her hands black with firewood ash. Your eyes look empty, the midwife said. That's not repentance. That's rot. If you want to atone, live like someone who still has a soul. Zuri stared at her. Then she picked up the bucket and kept scrubbing. The next night it rained. She sat under the overhang of the kitchen, pen in hand, writing again. My sister, the letter began, I don't deserve your eyes, your voice, or your name beside mine. But I carry you in every moment. You may never read this, but I need to believe that somewhere, somehow, you still breathe without pain. That one day you'll be happy, even if it means never speaking to me again. She folded the page and tucked it with the others. 57 letters now, hidden in a tin beneath the floor mat. She still wouldn't send them. She hadn't earned the right. But she wrote them anyway. Because sometimes repentance doesn't need an audience. Just honesty. And that night, while thunder rolled gently above, Zuri slept with one hand resting on the tin of unsent truths, her only comfort in a world she had broken with her own hands. The morning air was crisp, touched with the scent of charcoal smoke and blooming cassia. Amina stood at the edge of the village school, watching the dust settle as her students gathered with wide eyes and nervous giggles. It had been weeks since she'd last taught. Whispers had replaced greetings. Pity had replaced praise. But today she was back, not because the wound had healed, but because silence had started to suffocate her. Her first step into the classroom was quiet but firm. Books still sat where she left them. The chalk was dried and her desk had grown a thin veil of dust. She wiped it with her palm and breathed in. This space had once held her joy. Now it would hold her strength. Amina picked up the chalk and began to write. Today we begin again. Her students stared, then slowly, one by one, nodded. She didn't need their pity. She needed their attention. And slowly they gave it. In the days that followed, Amina didn't just teach reading and counting. She stayed after school, gathering the girls under the old neem tree, teaching them things that weren't in the curriculum. How to speak with clarity. How to set boundaries. How to recognize their worth even when others couldn't see it. Some of the elders whispered that she was spoiling them. But the mothers sent their daughters anyway. One afternoon, while the sun was just beginning to lean westward, a girl named Halima raised her hand. She was only 10 but always asked the sharpest questions. Auntie, she said, do you hate your sister? A hush fell across the group. Even the birds seemed to pause. Amina's hand stopped mid-motion as she was sketching a story in the sand. She looked up, meeting Halima's big curious eyes. Her voice came slowly but without shaking. I hurt, but I do not hate. It was the first time she had spoken aloud about Zuri since the betrayal. The words tasted bitter but the release was warm. Halima stood up and walked over, wrapping her small arms around Amina's waist. The girls followed, giggling and joining. And there, in the middle of the quiet circle, surrounded by hands that didn't understand the weight she carried, but still wanted to hold it, Amina smiled. That night, by the dim light of her oil lamp, she began to write. Not letters of grief but pages of ideas. Lesson plans rooted in healing, forgiveness and truth. A curriculum not approved by elders, but one her soul knew the village needed. She titled it, Roots and Wings, Teaching Daughters to Stay Grounded and Still Fly. Within a week she had mapped out 10 sessions. One on emotional wounds. One on women's choices. One on silence and when to break it. She invited a nurse to speak. Then a widow. Then a girl who had run away and returned wiser. Her hut, once a tomb of her heartbreak, now echoed with the voices of girls daring to dream louder. At the next elders' meeting they tried to push back. One said, girls need guidance, not freedom. Amina didn't raise her voice. She raised her presence. I am guiding them to be free. Because what crushed me will not crush them. They didn't clap. But they didn't stop her either. One Sunday evening as the shadows grew long, Amina walked the long path behind her uncle's compound. She had heard whispers that Zuri stayed in the kitchen hut. That she worked at the health center. That she barely spoke. Amina stood outside the small broken doorway. No one saw her. No one needed to. She didn't knock. Didn't call out. But she stood for a long while. There was no peace in her chest. Not yet. But there was something softer than hate. She turned and walked away, dust rising behind her like a whisper. That night, she added a new page to her curriculum, one titled simply, The Power of Standing Still. In the months that followed, villagers began to speak her name with quiet reverence. She teaches now like a queen without a crown, one said. She holds her pain like others hold books, said another. But Amina didn't care for praise. Her heart beat for the little girls who came running every morning, books in hand, eyes wide with hunger for more than what the world had told them they were worth. And each time someone asked her why she never broke, she only smiled. Because strength, she had learned, wasn't loud. Sometimes it was just showing up again and again even when your chest still ached. Sometimes it was loving truth more than revenge. And sometimes it was saying, I hurt, but I do not hate. And meaning it. Zuri lay curled on the straw mat, her breathing shallow, her body aching from labor that had come too early and too fast. The rain had started that morning, steady and cold, dripping through the cracks in the roof of the old kitchen hut where she now lived. No one had come, not Malik, not the aunties, not even the curious girls who once asked her about earrings or city perfumes. Only the midwife came, hobbling on creaky legs, wrapped in a shawl of memory and old cloth. Mama Sada had delivered both Zuri and Amina in this village decades ago. She hadn't delivered a child in years, but when she heard the rumors from the boy who fetched water, the sister of the teacher is about to give birth alone, she tied her wrapper tight and walked into the storm. She found Zuri alone in pain, her eyes wide with fear and sorrow. No husband. No warm hands. No hope. It's too soon, Zuri whispered. He wasn't supposed to come yet. Mama Sada said nothing. Her hands were already moving, preparing herbs, boiling cloth in a rusted pot, whispering prayers from her own grandmother's tongue. The child came just before midnight. Small. Pale. His cry was thin, more like a whisper than a wail. His chest moved strangely as if unsure it wanted to stay in this world. Zuri held him to her chest and wept. She named him Baraka. Blessing, she told the midwife. Because he lived. Even if just for tonight. Mama Sada watched the baby closely, frowning as she pressed her hand gently to his chest. His heart, she murmured. It doesn't beat like others. You'll need medicine. Real medicine. Zuri didn't ask where she would find it. She already knew she couldn't. She hadn't worked in weeks. Malik hadn't returned in days. She hadn't eaten more than cassava and tea for 3 days. That morning, Amina stood outside her hut, preparing tea when she saw the old midwife walk past in silence, her hands and shawl stained with something darker than rain. There was no announcement. No plea. No one came to tell her. But something inside her stirred. She didn't dress formally. She didn't braid her hair or wear shoes. She simply picked up the small pouch of savings she had tucked beneath her sleeping mat, the one she was using to buy books for the girls, and walked toward the edge of the village where the hut stood near the trees. The midwife was outside, washing a cloth in the rain. She looked up and stilled when she saw Amina. Inside, she said simply. Amina stepped through the low door and saw her. Zuri looked up, hair matted, face drawn, her arms wrapped tightly around the tiny form swaddled in worn fabric. Her eyes widened. She almost pulled the child away, as if expecting more pain, more shame. But Amina's voice was calm. I heard, she said. The child is ill. Zuri's lips trembled. You came. Why? Amina stepped closer and set the small pouch on the floor beside the fire pot. For medicine. He didn't ask to be part of this. Zuri could barely breathe. But I betrayed you. I broke you. Amina knelt beside her. She looked at the baby whose tiny lips quivered as he slept. You did, she said honestly. But he didn't. Zuri cried then, not with the loudness of drama, but with the quietness of regret that finally meets mercy. Mama Sada entered silently, watching the two sisters with the gaze of one who had lived long enough to know when something rare was happening. You'll need to get to the clinic by morning, Amina said. The nurse knows someone who can get the pills. Zuri nodded slowly, still staring at her. Why are you doing this? She whispered. Why now? Amina didn't answer at first. She reached out, brushing a finger lightly along the edge of the baby's cheek. Because the child didn't choose this story. She stood then as if the words had closed a door inside her. Not a door of pain, but one of permission. She had spoken what her heart had been circling for days. Outside, the rain began to soften, the clouds parting slightly, letting a thin line of moonlight fall across the village paths. As Amina walked back toward her hut, a few neighbors watched from their porches from behind curtains. No one said a word, but word traveled fast. By morning, everyone knew that Amina had gone, that she had helped, that she had not cursed the baby born of betrayal, but had named him worthy of life. The old women gathered by the well that afternoon and shook their heads in wonder. She gave her pain and got back dignity. She walked into fire and watered a flower. She is more than we imagined. Even the men, usually slow to praise, mentioned her name with quiet respect over their game of stones. That evening, children ran barefoot past Amina's hut with their schoolbooks, calling out for her to come outside. A soft breeze swept through the mango trees, and the air felt cleaner somehow. Zuri stayed quiet in her corner of the world, rocking Baraka and rereading the label on the small bottle the nurse had brought from the next town over. She didn't know if he would live. The doctors weren't sure. But she knew something had shifted. Because somewhere in the ashes of what they had burned, Amina had planted something that refused to die. Not just a child, but a new kind of possibility. And in that quiet space between guilt and grace, the story began to change. The sky over the village cleared that morning, as if the sun itself had waited for this day. Women's Day was always special, filled with dances, dishes simmering over fire, and stories told in a wide circle beneath the baobab tree. But this year felt different. The air was heavier, quieter, like something sacred was about to unfold. Amina arrived early, her white dress pressed and simple. Her students had braided flowers into her hair, whispering, "You look like peace today." She smiled but said nothing. She had not come for applause. She had come for release. The gathering began as usual. Songs were sung. The village chief's wife spoke about the power of the womb. Young girls recited poems about ancestors and dreams. Then came the storytelling circle, where each woman could speak her truth before witnesses, where no one interrupted and no one laughed. When Amina stepped forward, a hush fell. Even the women who had once urged her to curse her sister sat still, curious, almost nervous. Malik wasn't there. He had left the village months ago after his death swallowed what remained of his dignity. But Zuri sat near the edge, her son Baraka in her arms, his tiny chest rising and falling more steadily these days. Amina stood in the center and looked around, not over them, not beyond them, but into them. "I have a story," she said softly, "but not one you haven't already heard. You just heard it in whispers, in rumors, in fragments." She paused. "So let me speak it whole." She spoke not as a victim but as a witness to her own becoming. Of how joy had once bloomed in her life like jacaranda trees. Of how betrayal had ripped through her like fire through dry bush. Of how silence had become her refuge, and then her teacher. She did not name Zuri with bitterness. She did not describe the pain to gain pity. Instead she spoke of what came after. "I was told to hate," she said, eyes steady. "I was told to shame. But what would that make me? Another shadow of someone else's mistake? No. I chose differently." Heads nodded. A few women wiped their eyes. The midwife clutched her shawl. "I forgave," Amina said, her voice rising slightly. "Not because it was easy, but because it was the only way I could walk free." Then she turned. "Zuri." The name hovered in the air like a bird not sure it should land. Zuri stood, holding Baraka close. Her steps were slow but steady. When she reached Amina, she tried to kneel. But Amina stopped her. "No." She took her sister's hand and gently lifted her to her feet. "It was not my wedding that was stolen," Amina said, voice clear now. "It was my peace. And today I take it back, not through revenge but through release." Gasps filled the circle. One woman began to cry openly. Another reached for her sister's hand beside her. Amina placed her other hand on Baraka's back. "This child," she said, "is not a scar. He is a seed. And I choose to water him with grace." Baraka cooed then, and clapped his little hands together as if sensing the lightness falling over the space. The elders, seated in woven chairs under the tree, bowed their heads, not in judgment but in reverence. One whispered, "She has done what many of us never could." A young girl rushed forward with a small basket of petals and threw them into the air around the two sisters. Others followed. Soon the circle erupted in soft laughter and wet cheeks. The women began to sing, a tune older than the mango trees, older than the gossip, older than betrayal itself. A song of rising, of choosing life after ruin. Zuri wept, not from shame this time but from something deeper. From the feeling of being seen, and still being welcomed. When the ceremony ended, Amina and Zuri did not walk away holding hands. That was not necessary. Forgiveness didn't always look like closeness, but it looked like freedom. That night, when the fires were low and the stars blinked kindly, children spoke of the ceremony. One girl whispered to her friend, "Did you see how Amina glowed?" Another said, "I want to be that strong." And an old grandmother by the hearth whispered to herself, "This family, they have rewritten something. For all of us." Because forgiveness didn't just mend a wound. It carved a new path. One that other women could now walk too. The soil was soft that morning. Rain had kissed it the night before, and the scent of earth still lingered in the breeze. Amina stood behind the schoolhouse, a small fig sapling in her hands. Her students gathered silently around her, forming a gentle circle. Some of them clutched notebooks. Others carried watering cans. One little girl held Baraka, now toddling, giggling as a butterfly danced past his nose. Amina pressed her hands into the ground. Not forcefully, not in anger, just firmly, with care. She had chosen the fig tree for its patience, its quiet strength, its roots that deepened in silence. As she placed it into the earth, a hush fell over the children. Even the birds paused. "This," she said softly, dusting her hands, "is for all of us. A place to remember that healing isn't loud. It's steady." The children nodded. One girl leaned in and whispered, "Like you." Baraka waddled forward and clapped his hands. Zuri laughed gently, her presence still tentative but welcome. She no longer lived in the shadows behind her uncle's compound. After the forgiveness ceremony, she had returned to her own name, not as the sister who took, but the mother who was learning to give. She volunteered weekly now, helping the midwife, learning to become a healer. Malik, however, had disappeared from the story. Not abruptly, just gradually, like smoke thinning from a dying fire. The village never quite welcomed him again. He tried once or twice to show up with apologies and offerings. But what had been broken in him was different from what had been broken in the sisters. His apology arrived too late and too rehearsed. Eventually he left for another village where no one knew his story. Sometimes Zuri heard from him, but not often. She didn't expect much anymore. Her focus was Baraka, and the quiet strength she was rediscovering in herself. Amina, meanwhile, had begun to write. Not gossip. Not vengeance. But pages filled with truth, stitched with grace. Her book, The Line We Write, a story of sisters, storms, and starting again, was finished 1 year after the fig tree was planted. She didn't think it would go far. But it did. First, the village women passed it around in hushed awe. Then the nearby towns asked her to speak. Then came invitations to conferences, then school visits across the region. Her story, one of betrayal, heartbreak, and quiet defiance, found its way into classrooms, hearts, and hidden diaries of young girls who needed to believe they could rebuild. When someone asked her at a book reading, "How did you forgive?" Amina smiled. Because pain grows when you carry it. But love grows when you plant it. She didn't say more than that. She didn't need to. The fig tree behind the school became a kind of sacred place. Girls would sit beneath it after exams. Some would cry there. Others would write poetry in its shade. When the first fruit appeared, Amina plucked it with her students and shared it during their Women's Day tea. One student asked her, "Miss Amina, will you marry one day?" She smiled and replied, "Maybe, maybe not. But being a woman is not measured by who stands beside you. It's measured by what you stand for." They had written that quote in chalk across the front of the school. It stayed there, weathering through seasons, stubborn like truth. Zuri often brought Baraka to visit the fig tree. He liked to sit near the roots and dig with his fingers, asking endless questions. One day, as he was tracing circles in the dirt, he asked, "Mama, is this tree mine too?" Zuri looked at Amina. Amina nodded, kneeling beside him. "Yes, Baraka. It belongs to all who are born from brokenness and still choose to bloom." In that moment, the line that had once split the sisters, drawn in betrayal, shaded in silence, was redrawn. Not erased but transformed. It became a path instead of a wall. A story instead of a scar. As the years passed, the fig tree grew taller, fuller. So did the girls Amina taught, many of whom returned to teach after studying in the city. They told her often, "You showed us that marriage is not the only ceremony a woman must prepare for." And Amina, seated beneath her fig tree, would smile, because legacy wasn't something written in bloodlines. It was written in choices. In hands that chose to build rather than burn. In roots that chose to stay even when the wind came howling. And in the end, it wasn't Malik's name the village remembered. It was Amina's. Planted in the heart of every girl who had ever been told her worth was tied to a man. And in the branches of a tree that bore witness to a new kind of womanhood, strong, quiet, and free. She did not throw stones where betrayal had broken her steps. She planted roots. In soil soaked with silence and shaded by sorrow. She pressed her fingers gently, choosing growth over rage, choosing tomorrow over what yesterday shattered. She did not burn bridges with anger. She built new paths with dignity. While the world waited for her to scream, she whispered instead, into notebooks, into classrooms, into the ears of girls told to shrink their dreams. And those whispers became echoes, then songs, then lessons that outlived pain. Her sister wore the veil, yes, the one meant for her. But she wore the crown of forgiveness, woven in pain, softened in truth, set not with diamonds, but with the steady heartbeat of someone who chose not to hate. There was a time when the village watched with mouths full of judgment, hearts full of rumors, but even the harshest tongues fell silent. When they saw her rise, not above but deeper, into healing, into stillness, into a kind of strength they could not measure with marriage. And now, when little girls speak of power, they do not whisper of weddings. They speak of Amina, the teacher, the daughter, the sister who did not turn her back, even when the world turned its back on her. They speak of the fig tree, the one behind the school, where stories were sown like seeds, and hope grew wild without asking permission. They speak of the day she stood in the circle, not to accuse, but to release, of how her voice didn't tremble when she rewrote history with grace, of how her arms reached not to strike, but to lift. They speak of how she forgave the unforgivable, not because it didn't hurt, but because she knew pain, left unchecked, multiplies in the mouths of the next generation. And now, when the sun kisses the village roofs, when girls tie their headscarves and walk to school, they walk with her story on their backs, like a second skin. They say, she didn't just teach us letters and numbers, she taught us how to rebuild. And in the hush of dusk, when mothers hum lullabies and grandmothers braid hair, Baraka plays beneath the fig tree, a child born from storms, now growing under shade planted by mercy, because Amina did not seek revenge. She sought rebirth, because she did not silence her pain. She spoke it softly, then turned it into bridges, because she did not write her story with a pen. She wrote it with her heart. And that is how the line was redrawn, not in blood, but in love.